Island of Sodor is surrounded by beautiful blue sea. It has fields of green and sandy yellow beaches. There are rivers, streams and lots of trees where the birds sing. There are windmills and a coal mine and docks where visitors to the island arrive. The island also has lots and lots of railway lines. But wait, who's that puffing down the track? Could it be? It's Thomas! Hello, Thomas!
Hello everyone, I'm Thomas, and welcome to the Island of Sodor.
When I first started planning the making of this video, I wasn't really sure how to start. Hell, I wasn't even sure where to start. This video, or at least the premise of it, has been in the making for a very long time. It even tracks back as far as I can remember to about before I built my very first model. I'd never done this before. All my models had been 3D printed beforehand, so I never really knew how to work with brass. And I wanted this video to be special, so I wasn't gonna just do what I normally do. Since the moment I found out that Thomas's brass model was made of brass, I wanted to be able to replicate something just like it. It became my mission to achieve complete brassiness. But of course I couldn't jump straight into it. I had to get myself familiar with Gauge 1 model making and understanding basics before I could jump into a project so ambitious. So I wasn't gonna rest until I knew exactly what I had to do to make this model happen. Over the course of 2 years and 38 Thomas models, and talking to a ton of people, learning the ins and outs of Gauge 1 modeling, I was able to come up with a pretty decent idea of what I had to do. Now, this wasn't gonna be easy, nor was it gonna be any form of fast project or something that was gonna be done within the matter of weeks. As I said before, this model took a lot of planning and a lot of just overall brainstorming before I could bring anything into the physical realm and start mangling brass with my bare hands. Every time I made a Thomas model, every time I improved on something that I did with my original model, and every time I made somebody else's model, I learned more and more things of what I had to do and what not to do when making this model. I had to understand the ins and outs. I had to understand exactly what to do before I could move on to anything physical. ways, so I immediately moved on to the body. The body was, I would say, as equally as difficult as the running board, but it was still an easy task now that I knew what to do specifically. So I started with the side walls and the top of the tanks. During this time, I was also experimenting with smaller brass parts and soldering things together. I wasn't too sure of exactly where to get Thomas's hit era coupling hooks from, because I had no idea what they were. I also saw Noah make some scratch-built coupling hooks for his salty replica, so I was like, hell, I can do that too. So I ran down to Hobby Lobby, grabbed a couple of brass rods, went back home, sat down, whipped out the soldering iron, and got to work. And in no time, I had some semi-decent looking scratch-built screw-link couplings. After I made the first set, I let the guys know exactly what I was up to, and then they didn't approve. Then they graciously pointed out that the original couplings were 10-mile couplings, which, admittedly, I guess I had to go for the accuracy, so I buckled down and accepted the cyberbullying once more and got myself 2 10-mile screw-link couplings. They were not having it, man. I tried to make handmade couplings because I didn't know about 10-mile ones, and I tried my best. They looked the part. Yeah, whatever. Who cares about the couplings right now? I'm still in the process of building the body. Let's fast track a little bit here, but I managed to figure out the body and have the main parts soldered together. I had the top of the tanks and the back soldered to both sides of the body, but I didn't have the cab. And this is where I ran into my first issue with the brass. I must have did math wrong here or didn't double check the measurement, but the cab walls were thinner than the back part of the body, which if, 1 plus 2, they're supposed to be the same size. Whatever, we can fix this. But I'd have to do that. In the meantime, while I tried to mentally figure out how to fix this issue, I decided to move on because there was absolutely no time to hang around. So I decided to bust out some of the brass I had and hand cut myself a brass roof. I used brass shears, I used a PVC pipe, I used some heat, some manhandling gloves, and I used a heck of a whole lot of pressure. And then eventually, with some filing around the edges and some proper shaping and lining up, I managed to make a brass roof. Now, I understand that this is just a curved piece of a brass rectangle, and at this moment in time, after having to resolder and solder back and cut down and chip off and almost dropping stuff, and making the brass roof was something that really gave back hope, really gave me the inspiration and the drive forward that I needed to get this project done. Then I used my newly found skills of hand cutting brass and filing it down to make Thomas's brass neck. After that, I used some brass tubes of the appropriate size for the dome and funnel. But of course, nothing I had was the right shape I needed for the brass funnel tops and domes, so I just used resin for the time being. I was pretty much fine with this. I cut more strips of brass for the brass splashers, and those guys were done. I even gave them little labels. Yeah, they're the same on each side, but I like to have them labeled for some reason. Don't judge me! At this point, Thomas was around 70% brass. I couldn't have been more proud of myself. And I pretty much came to a standstill when it came to Thomas's overall build. I also didn't know how to give him a brass boiler. Then of course, Noah came out from the clouds once more and showed me a site where to get this brass bitch a boiler, and so I did. It arrived and I immediately got to measuring and cutting and cutting and measuring. Thomas's smoke box, boiler, and running board curve are all made of the same diameter brass tube, so I was able to cut this bad boy up into miniature pieces and get things stuck together in no time. The running board was officially the first part of Thomas to be fully made of brass. After I had the piece of the running board cut and soldered down to have that nice, delicious looking curve, it goes without saying that Tuffy was pretty excited. After test fitting this thing, it was time to really get into action. I had to solder this thing down now. But before I did, my good buddy Jamos, she told me about some of the most wonderful tools in the world. Helping hands. Helping hands are a pair of, I don't know what type of metal they're made of, but they're basically clamps that are able to position themselves in any way I see fit and hold the hot metal while I solder. And at this time I had a smaller torch, so I had a more controlled flame, and my god do I tell you that this really changed the game. I then used this information to hold the boiler, hold the cab fronts, had everything soldered down. This made soldering smaller parts so much easier. The front end of his cabs were pretty much a one-and-done bit scenario, but then I had to buckle down and do some of the hardest parts I've ever done, such as his bunker curve.
Oh my goodness!
I knew that bending this piece of brass with my bare hands and a couple of pliers wasn't going to do the job, so I asked a couple people, hey, how the hell am I supposed to bend a 0.8mm thick piece of brass? They then introduced me to one of the most beautiful tools I've ever had the pleasure of using. This is called a vise, and a vise allowed me to put the piece of brass I needed and bend it to shape accordingly. It was absolutely a game changer. So with the power of my vise, my pure man strength, and the helping hands, I was able to make the curve of the brass bunker and solder it into place. Thomas's brass parts were almost fully put together, but the only problem I had here was the dome and the funnel. At this time, Thomas still didn't have his funnel and dome knocked into place. I didn't want to limit myself just in case one of these days I wanted to add a smoke mech to Thomas, so I had to drill a hole into the top part of his smoke box. A stepper drill allows me to drill into the brass at smaller intervals and eventually get to the diameter size that I was hoping to achieve. After 4 more billion attempts of soldering down his dome and funnel, I managed to get them even and at the right heights. In the meantime, I also did solder down some ways to screw Thomas down to his body to the running board, and we're not going to talk about that part. I only did 2 of them. Come on, listen, soldering down these screws, it was hard work, okay? I only had time to do 2 because they kept moving, they kept sliding, I couldn't really see inside the body. Come on, you would have done the exact same thing. You would have done the exact same thing! Later along down the line, Thomas's 10-mile couplings arrived, and I couldn't wait to put these bad boys together. But my only issue was, I didn't know how. The only other person I've known to put together 10-mile couplings was Thomas Tank Merch, and they told me that I had to use something called a metric tap. And of course, the one I needed was so small that the local hardware stores were not gonna have something like that in supply. So, to make a long story short, I ended up using a little hand drill to open up the parts that are supposed to go together, and I used an X-Acto knife to open up the hook, slip the brass parts in, and close it back up with some super glue, and we've got accuracy on 100, baby! I forgot to mention this earlier, but I ended up spending a very embarrassing amount of money on brass domes and funnel tops for Thomas instead of using the resin ones you've seen in the images prior, because, again, cyberbullying and peer pressure has taken full effect on the mind, and I've had to succumb to the pressure. After consulting with a few people, I realized that the brass Thomas, the original model that I'm trying to replicate here, his smoke box was soldered down to the running board, and accuracy as goes is accuracy as goes. I decided to do the same. At this moment in time, Thomas's body, everything was perfectly put together and made of brass. This was crazy. I was holding a brass Thomas replica in my hands, made by me specifically. This was the greatest feeling I've had for a while. He was cleaned off, he was shiny, he was ready for his little extra bits right before the filling and priming, and it's like nothing could go wrong. Oh yeah, the chassis. Oh my god, how could I have forgot about my favorite part of this whole damn... The process of making the chassis is a battle that I'm still currently fighting today. I feel like there won't be a solid update until way later. But I'm just gonna show you and tell you basically what I had to go through. The original chassis was a prototype chassis that I built from using Jamos's recently constructed CAD files, and this chassis was fully bricked up. This chassis was fully geared up, which did prove to show me a little bit of a difficulty and really challenged my expertise when it comes to motorizing chassis, and I hate them so much. I've made 3D printed chassis in the past, and as far as I'm aware, they didn't really turn out that well. They were fragile and shattered pretty much the moment they started moving, but that was way before I knew anything about anything. Seeing Jamos achieve something so great with the chassis she has printed for herself, I thought that I could do the same.
But my god, was I wrong.
I didn't know the next thing when it came to fully geared chassis, much less gear ratios and how they all work. The chassis I 3D printed for myself was too stiff at one point, the gears kept locking up, it didn't roll as freely as Jamos's. I thought that maybe the gears needed a little bit of guidance with some oil, and that didn't work. But after some consulting, I did manage to make the chassis run a little bit smoother.
It's really late, but like, oh my fucking god. It fucking worked. It fucking worked. Oh my god, it's so good.
The next step was having the motor mounted to the chassis the proper way. Using reference pictures of Stanley's spare chassis owned by Tom's Props, I then had the idea to make my chassis pretty much the same as that. That's also when I realized that I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. So for the time being, I had to scrap that idea and go for the good old classic worm drive. The worm-driven chassis seemed to be the most reliable and the most dependent, but this is exactly what I had to do. I was really excited to have this thing going, but something felt off. Something felt weird about having a 3D printed chassis block and gears alongside a solid brass model of Thomas. That's when my good friend Goodwin came down from above and slammed this massive chassis block down on my desk from thousands of miles away. I couldn't have been more excited to get this bad boy underneath the Thomas body and get this fucker rolling. I had to take one of the Markland wheels that I had and pop off the wheels on both ends, put on some bearings, and fit it to the chassis. And might I tell you, this chassis ran like a dream. Well, not ran, it was really smooth when you pushed it, because I haven't figured out the motor situation, but we'll get to that. The original plan was to pretty much replicate what I've been doing before, but that wouldn't work. Putting the worm drive gear on this chassis, it wouldn't work. It was too heavy. It's not... Damn it! I wanted to give up around this time because I was unsure of a direct drive gear. I ran through quite a few different tests of making gearboxes for the chassis. But we'll get back to that, because we have to talk about something else. Since Thomas is completely made of metal, I had to use something called etching primer. It's basically a primer that allows paint to stick to metal without it flaking off over time. After Thomas was in his very delicious military green, I then gave him a pink primer. After Thomas got his pink primer, the process was gonna be as simple as it comes, you know? A good old-fashioned TS23 and TS10 and call it a day. And that's what I did. Thomas was given the good old 1-2-1-2 and painted blue before I even knew. The parts after that were then painted black and were given a good old finish of matte. What I should have said is that I went ahead and painted the running board red. Although it was first, there wasn't much to say, but I then painted the top a nice stone gray. After a couple of days of Thomas just sitting in his nice, freshly painted blue coat, he was ready for his lining, and I wanted to throw in a little more accuracy. So after a few days of trying to figure out exactly how they did it on the show, we found out that they used what are called dry transfers to make Thomas's lining, especially in the hair. And for the fact that making dry transfers by hand at home is pretty either expensive or impossible, I had to go back and use vinyl like the good old days. Around this time was the time I was able to pretty much work with the CoolProps Thomas. Whoa! The color difference between the two were extremely noticeable. After a lot of back and forth and holding the CoolProps Thomas model in person, it really opened my mind to the idea that these models were painted for the idea that they were going to be seen on camera and not to look good in person. The blue I've been used to was a lot more vibrant in person, and I guess so on camera too, than they should have been. So I ran down to the local paint store and had the blue paint matched, and I had my Thomas model repainted into the accurate colors. But with that being said, the red on the CoolProps model was not very accurate, and it was a little too light. So with digging around and a little bit of help from a few people, I managed to deduce what type of red this was, and it was the same red that's shared by the brand Coca-Cola. After Thomas's body was repainted with the proper blue, I finished up the lining, gave the body a matte clear, and this model, he was looking delicious at this point. You know, making this model, it really offered some challenges along the way and some stuff that I couldn't really overcome, but managed to get there in the end, you know? Thomas is really looking up to speed. What was that? The chat? We already talked about the chassis. We have to go back. We gotta go back. We gotta go back and talk about the chassis, because I decided that I was gonna give Thomas a Well, I was gonna give him a... Once again, I was back on track of learning new stuff that I have never done before. And a smoke mech, I didn't even think was possible for a model this small, but if someone I knew can do it, then I guess I could do it too. And that someone being, of course, Jamos. Right now, we're cracking new grounds. This is something I've never done before. I've never had to put a smoke mech inside of a model such as Thomas, or at this point, I've never had to work with a smoke mech at all. Well, the thing about a smoke mech is that I needed some way of pumping air into the smoke mech to get the smoke out through a tube and out of the funnel. And of course, the most classic way of doing this was gonna have to be a pump that pushes the smoke out of the unit. And that meant I had to find a way to motorize this chassis with a direct drive and have enough space inside of Thomas's body for the battery, the receiver, the smoke mech, and the gears to stick on top of the chassis rather than having the motor inside of the chassis block. Now, in order to do this, I had to have a gear with an arm that would then move back and forth as the chassis was going, and that gear would have to be connected to the direct drive, and that arm had to be connected to a balloon at the back of the smoke unit that would push the balloon back and forth, that would then in turn blow air into the unit and smoke out of the tube and out the top of the funnel, creating, of course, the effect of a steam engine exerting smoke. Now, if I explained every little detail and thing I learned about motor torque and gear ratios and etc, I'd be here all day and this video would be 4.5 hours long. But I'm not gonna do that. I had to go through about 20 different gearboxes that I made to accommodate both the motor gears, the motor, and the smoke mech, and to have the servos mounted to the chassis rather than the side of the body to be a little more accurate, seeing that the best way to maintain Thomas himself would to be just remove the body instead of taking the body off of the chassis. Now, the original 9-gram servos were a bit too big for what I was going for here, but the smaller servos, I believe these are 4.2 grams, they fit perfectly mounted to the arm of the unit here that I created, and I also upgraded how the iMech works. It's a lot more accurate to the show, how it now has this weird catheter silicone tube on the back end of the eye bracket and on the arm that attaches to the servo, so that it allows for a more open, free range of movement. No part of me really wants to get into the gear ratios and torques and motors and all of that for specifically how the chassis works, because I'm still learning on how to do that myself, and the last thing I want to do is toss out some information that's pretty wrong or not the best way of doing things, or the way I'm doing it, it works for me and I couldn't say that it would work for anybody else. There were multiple different plans to give power to the smoke mech, and only one ended up working as of now. The original plan was to have the wires from the smoke mech direct power from the motor rather than having its own power source to begin with. But the only issue here was that I'd have to essentially warm up the smoke mech before actually using it by running Thomas around a little bit. The only issue with that is that the motor wouldn't be supplying power to the smoke mech at all times. So instead of getting a good plume of smoke through the funnel on startup, I'd have to essentially warm him up by running the motor for a little bit. The second method, which hasn't worked in the slightest, was to drive power from the receiver and have an on and off switch attached between them. So the receiver, which is connected to channel 6, of this controller, so when I turn it on and off, it gives power to that and allows it to smoke independently or receive power without, the motor giving it power. So I can obviously run the motor and not worry about that, but when I turn this on, now it's receiving power, the switch is on, give it a couple seconds to warm up. On here, let's see if I can get this whole shot. Just listen. It's making power. Making smoke. Getting power. It's fine. This is exactly what I'm trying to achieve. Until now it's doing that. The problem there is that I would have a 7.4 volt battery constantly streaming into the smoke mech instead of having the recommended 6 volts. I could just use a 6 volt battery altogether, but I wouldn't have a lot of milliamps, so it wouldn't be able to power everything else like the motor and the iMech. I'm running an RC here, people. And the third option, which so far is the best one, is giving the smoke mech its own battery. And instead of having that battery plugged directly into the smoke mech and constantly feeding it power, of course, JMOS then recommended me again to have a on and off switch to feed the power when I need it and feed the power when I don't, so then I can run Thomas without having to pump smoke. It's a great method and it works. At this moment in time, Thomas is pretty much a fully working model, besides the lights, but we don't want to worry about that. But despite all that, I feel like this model has finally been something, and I've been brought somewhere where I've learned so much more about model making and how the show did it and what I can and can't do, and I could provide more information to you all than I ever could if I'd never ever decided to make something as ambitious as this. And now that I've completed this model and I feel like all the hard work on this guy's finally been done, I guess it's time to go home. And I believe Thomas agrees with me here, so that appears to be the end of the story. I really hope to be speaking to you all again about some of the even bigger projects I have going on. Don't you?